Okay, Governor Andrew Cuomo and New York State Conservation Department Director Basil Sagos. Let's talk coronavirus and the massive septic tank leach fields, the brown fields, the dirty diapers all around Lake George. You see, ladies and gentlemen, when you have a septic system, it uses leach field technology, and all of this sewage goes into the leach field and saturates the soils, creating a brown field, or what I like to refer to as a dirty diaper. Now, when it rains or when the snowpack melts and large amounts of groundwater soak into the ground in the brown field or the septic field, all of that water from the rain and the snowpack melt mix in with the sewage in the septic in the leach field. On Lake George, there's thousands of septic systems, brown fields all around the lake. I hope you're taking notes, Governor Andy Cuomo. Basil Sagos, he knows what I'm talking about here. The brown fields of Lake George. Now, because Lake George is a giant rock basin, it's all rock, there's only one place for all this contaminated water to go. It all leaks, it leaches, it drains into Lake George, all of it, out of the dirty diaper brown fields of all those septic tank leach fields. Now let's talk coronavirus. And let's talk about the fact that Lake George is a big PETRI dish. It's a great big swimming pool. That's what Lake George is. And of course, the New York State tourism industry invites millions of people to come wash their butts cracks and their genitals in Lake George when they go swimming. They invite millions of people to go bathing in Lake George, in the water that is full of all the stuff from the brown fields, from the leach fields, Governor Cuomo, Basil Sagos. Now, David Wick this morning at the Lake George Park Commission. I had a pretty long conversation with David Wick about the flushing, the wintertime release of large amounts of water, the wintertime drawdown, which they call what is it that you said, David Wick? You were flushing the lake? You see, David Wick, when you let all that water out of the lake to make room for lots of fresh water in the spring, you're environmentally flushing the lake. That's what Lake George Park Commission does. They are the lake flushers. When you let a huge amount of water out of the lake so that the hydroelectric generation company at Ticonderoga can turn it all into electricity for money, it's called flushing the lake, David Wick. Now, Roger Smith, he's a pretty good old friend of mine. And you know, David Wick, I was telling you this morning, I worked for Frank Bushy, the Bushy Construction Company. I worked for Alger Mason, the Mason Construction Company. I worked for Dean Howland and John Matthews and Scotty McLaughlin, just to name a few, all around the lake. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm the guy that built a lot, not all, but I'm a guy that built a lot of those septic systems on the bedrock, on Pilot Knob, in Assembly Point, and Rockhurst. Let's not forget Rockhurst and Sandy Bay, and Cleverdale, and Assembly Point, and all around Dunham's Bay on down to the Lake George Village. I built hundreds and hundreds of septic systems on the bedrock at Lake George. And I'm just, you know, David Wick understood that when you flush all this sewage and contaminate the soil in the leach fields, when it rains and the snowpack melts, all that water soaks into the ground and right through the tea bag, right through the coffee grounds. They percolate the leach field, the brown field, and it leaks straight into the lake, turning Lake George into a giant PETRI dish full of bacteria and nutrients and phosphates and all kinds of other chemicals and toxins and bodily waste. It's full of bodily waste, ladies and gentlemen. That's what Lake George is full of, bodily waste. And then the Lake George Park Commission controls the flushing. David Wick, you're a lake flusher. That's what you do for a living, David. You're the guy that flushes the commode. And Basil Sagos and the DEC offices at Raybrook, New York, and the Lake George Land Commission, and the Fund for Lake George, and the Lake George Association, and the Lake George Mirror, and the Adirondack Almanac, and the Glens Falls Post-Star all know that David Wick is a toilet lake flusher. He's the one that controls the release of large amounts of leachate contaminated Lake George water into the Poop Chute River. How about that, David Wick? Let's call it the Poop Chute River, where huge amounts of sewage from the village and town of Ticonderoga are flushed into Lake Champlain. A whole bunch of sewage goes right in front of Fort Ticonderoga with all those mill waste, the millions of cubic yards of mill waste from the old International Power Corporation. The Pulp and Paper and Power. They were hydroelectric generator company. International Power. Now, to recap this, we are living in an age of coronavirus. And not just in Lake George, and not just in the Poop Chute River, and not just in Lake Champlain, but in the St. Lawrence Seaway. And in the Great Lakes, like Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie. They flush huge amounts of sewage from all the towns and villages and cities around the Great Lakes. And then, of course, with the Moses Sanders Dam, as they're generating large amounts of electricity, they're flushing it into the St. Lawrence Seaway. Oh, and then, of course, Canada, Montreal and Quebec and Newfoundland, they all flush their sewage into the rivers and creeks that go to the Bay of Fundy and go out there to the Atlantic Ocean. David Wick. They flush huge amounts of sewage into the St. Lawrence River using the Great Lakes, just like Lake George, David Wick, and they flush the St. Lawrence River. And the Hudson River is the same thing. Governor Andrew Cuomo. Huge amounts of sewage go into the Hudson River. And, of course, every day, the huge garbage barges, Governor Cuomo, they take all the landfill materials out there and they bury it off of Long Island and Block Island and Connecticut. They dump all of New York's garbage into the Atlantic Ocean. All the medical wastes and the bodily wastes and the infectious wastes go into the ocean. Andrew Cuomo, just like the contaminated brownfields, the dirty diapers all around Lake George go into the lake. Go into the PETRI dish called Lake George, the toilet lake. It's a toilet lake, David Wick. You flush the toilet lake, David Wick, for a job, professionally. And the people that work for the Lake George Park Commission and the people that work for Raybrook Environmental Conservation Office, Raybrook, New York, everybody knows it. There are witnesses to the fact that all of these septic systems drain into the lake. That's all there is to it. So, David Wick, you're a front row seat, first-tier level material witness, along with Roger Smith and everybody that works for the Fund for Lake George, everybody that works for the Darren Freshwater Institute, and everybody over at the Lake George Association. The Lake George Association, David Wick. All of the brownfields, all of the dirty diapers drain into Lake George. Now, folks, all the information that you need is right below. And I want to close this out. Governor Cuomo was saying this. Lake George is a hot spot for coronavirus. Lake George is a hot spot for every other kind of virus and bacteria. Lake George is a giant septic tank that David Wick makes sure gets flushed into the Poop Chute River every year. And that's just the way it is, ladies and gentlemen. Lake George, the Poop Chute River, and Lake Champlain dump all this sewage and waste into the St. Lawrence River through the Richelieu. The Richelieu River runs out of the north end of Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain, Governor Cuomo in Vermont State, is a toilet lake. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave it right there. And as always, beware of the coronavirus. Don't swim in it. Don't go up to Lake George and get in your bathing suit and party on and get in that lake because it's full of viruses and bacteria. David Wick. Flushing the lake can only go on so long without the truth, the facts, and the history being revealed. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the way it is today in America. Coronavirus is on the loose. Andrew Cuomo, Donald Trump. Donald Trump's from New York. Have you ever swam? Did you ever swim? Donald Trump. Did you ever go swimming in the Petri dish? The Petri dish at Lake George? Or the Hudson River? Donald Trump. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave it right there. And as always, hasta la vista. God bless and beware of the coronavirus.